The duty that I impose much more absolutely on corporate leaders is to avoid complicity in human rights violations. That's the bottom line. That's not something where you can equivocate.
Hi there, and welcome to Voices from the Institute for Human Rights and Business, also known as IHRB. I am Deborah Sago, and in this podcast, you'll hear from people working to make respect for human rights part of everyday business. You've just heard from Kenneth Roth. Ken is a lawyer, a writer, and the former executive director of one of the world's leading human rights organizations, Human Rights Watch. In this episode, Ken and my colleague Salil Tripathi discuss the unraveling international order and its impact on long-standing commitments to human rights. Salil asks whether these changes will trigger regression in corporate responsibility, as well as other important themes from Ken's new book, Righting Wrongs. They also discuss Ken's views on effective tactics to hold companies to account. But first, let's hear from Salil. So Salil, tell me about Kenneth, because he's a key figure in the world of international human rights, isn't he?
Absolutely. Kenneth Roth is a very prominent name. He has been an amazingly powerful leader for Human Rights Watch, one of the two largest human rights organizations in the world, with exceptional research and advocacy record. And he has been very pivotal. He has also had a ringside view of what's going on. He has lobbied at the UN, in Geneva, in New York, with governments, and he has been a thorn in the flesh for many dictators and autocrats around the world. And he's seen everything at the close quarters. He's been there from the fall of the Berlin Wall, the promise that globalization offered, what people thought would mean when there would be a world without barriers. And then he has seen the barriers emerge once again. And at the same time, he has continued to keep holding the flame alive for human rights. And he also has seen in this context what it means about the changes that are now going on in the United States and about the retreat from the international order that we are seeing.
Well, that's indeed a fascinating career journey. Why did you want to speak to him?
I think part of the reason is his record. I mean, he has been an eyewitness to history in a way, because he was at the helm of Human Rights Watch for several decades. And therefore, he has seen the transition from the cold, dark period of the Cold War on one hand, and from there, the promise that was brought in after that, and then the dark clouds that are hovering over us all over again. And then there is the whole talk about what it means for the 70-year-old architecture of international human rights. So does this mean we are in for a very bleak period? And I wanted to get some reassurances from Ken.
What I try to show in the book is that, there have been good times and bad times. Things get better and worse. But regardless of the despot, regardless of the dictator, there is always an angle. There's always a way to force them to better respect human rights. And it's not just a matter of signing onto treaties. I make that clear very much at the outset. The treaty gives a certain legitimacy to a human rights organization. Somebody says, who are you? When I come in to talk to them, I can say, well, look, I'm just trying to uphold the standards that you theoretically signed up for. But in fact, what matters is the public sense of right and wrong. When we shine a spotlight on governmental misconduct, if people say, that's not so bad, we don't get much done. But if people condemn it, if they feel that it's wrong, that helps to put pressure on governments. It's embarrassing, it's shameful, it's delegitimizing, because every government pretends to respect human rights. It's a way of showing that they try to serve their people rather than just themselves, which is often the case. And so if we can show that their pretense is not true, that the ugly reality is very different, that puts serious pressure on them. And they respond by attacking us and saying we're biased or misunderstood or
Western.
Or even Western. But, the Western is a cheap argument.
Yeah.
Because, you hear various autocrats in the global South saying that. But I've traveled the world. I've never met a person in the global South who wants to be summarily executed. I've never seen somebody who wants to be tortured or detained for their political views or discriminated against or denied, food or housing or medical care. So these are really universal desires. It's just autocrats who are trying to deflect criticism for their repression, that they try to pretend that these are Western imports, rather than focusing on the fact that they themselves, the autocrat, is denying the people of their country the rights that they want. So the Western imposition is a really weak argument. Now, this is obviously a difficult time, but I also think that it's more complicated than many people feel. The common wisdom these days is that autocrats are ascendant, democracy is in decline. But in fact, if you look at people who live under autocrats, they've pretty clearly made public that they don't want that. They want accountable government. They want democracy. We've seen that just this past weekend in Serbia, but we've seen it in Hong Kong, Thailand, Myanmar, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Iran, Russia, Belarus. I mean, it can go around the world. And sometimes it's successful. We got rid of the autocrats in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka. Other times they hang on through repression. But people really do make clear what they want. But I think in many ways, the bigger threat these days is in established democracies, where autocrats have figured out how to demonize certain minorities. It could be Muslims, it could be immigrants, it could be gays, and try to blame them for society's ills. And that cheap argument resonates with people who feel left behind by democracy, feel that they're not being served, that they're stagnating economically, they're facing growing inequality, they're not respected, they're not listened to. And those are the people left behind who are ripe for the autocrats' appeal. And I think our challenge is really, on the one hand, to make democracy better serve everybody. But also we have to respond to the cheap scapegoating of the autocrats. Because, if you say, oh, it's just the Muslims who did this, that's a cheap excuse for why is the government not actually fixing the problems facing, say, working class people. So I think that's the challenge before us. What I try to do with the book is give story after story of the strategies that we've used to successfully put pressure on governments, because governments are always tempted to violate human rights. It's an easy way to stay in power, to get rid of the opposition. But if we can change the cost-benefit calculations behind repression, we can make repression not pay as well. And we can gradually put pressure on governments to change. And that's just not a theoretical proposition. I show it with example after example, even in some of the world's most difficult cases. So I want the book actually to be hopeful, because it is a strategy guide. It says, these are the tools that can work. You have to adapt it to the moment. You got to adapt it to Trump. You got to adapt it to your autocrat, your repressor of the moment. But there is always an angle. There's always something you can do. And that's what I hope people take away from my book.
You've anticipated my next question, which was what were the reasons for hope, and you've outlined some. I'm going to go into that a little later. But I have worked for 25 years on business and human rights. And the Institute, of course, focuses on business and the role of business as a constructive player and how to restrain it from its bad tendencies. So what role do you see for business? Because again, speaking about that 1998-99 period, you were in a sense at the launchpad moment. Because I remember Human Rights Watch wrote those first reports on Nigeria and Sudan back in the mid-90s. And Amnesty was also doing similar reports at that time. Corporate engagement had become big. Voluntary codes were coming up. And Kofi Annan gives this famous speech at Davos and talks about the need for a global compact soon after the World Trade Organization summit, which was it kind of anticipated the discontent that people were feeling with globalization. And then you have the Ruggie process and the guiding principles, and we are in a situation where we feel we have some keys to make corporations behave better. But with companies now reneging their commitments on climate, on ESG, on DEI, the diversity, equity, and inclusion doctrine, are we now in a period of retreat? Are we back to mid-90s?
No, we're totally not back to the mid-90s, because, Salil, you're going to remember this well. But when we started early on talking about the human rights or the social responsibilities of corporations, you probably remember this. They would look at you like you're crazy. That's maybe what NGOs do, but I'm a corporate CEO. My job is to make a profit for my shareholders, period. End of story. Go home. And today, nobody maintains that view. And it's not that corporate CEOs have suddenly become good guys. It's that they've recognized that ignoring human rights, ignoring social issues can be an economic disaster for their company. It leads to consumer discontent. It can lead to shareholder action challenges. It makes it much more difficult to recruit the next generation of workers. It makes it difficult to maintain employee morale. I mean, all of these have very severe economic consequences for a corporation. So today, every corporate leader at least mouths their commitment to human rights and social justice. I mean, that's become de rigueur. Now, do they all live up to it? Of course not. They're no different from governments in that respect. Although, one thing that I found is that corporations are actually more sensitive to public criticism than governments are. Because with governments, the criticism has to get to a critical mass where they feel that they're politically jeopardized. But if a corporation is facing significant bad media attention, they immediately worry about loss of consumers. They worry about morale problems. They worry about getting a bad reputation when they recruit new staff. And so the thresholds to gain the attention of a corporate CEO is actually much lower than the thresholds to secure the attention of, say, a national leader. So in that sense, I don't feel we've gone back to the 90s at all. Now, you note that there is these days a certain retrenchment. In other words, Trump is attacking DEI. He's attacking concern with climate. And so you see, particularly in the United States, corporations kind of scrubbing their websites of these terms. They just don't want to become targets. But that doesn't change the underlying dynamic because, yes, while they are worried about retaliatory actions by the U.S. government, and Trump has shown himself willing to attack anybody who differs from him, even if it's unconstitutional, even if he's flouting basic rights, companies still are deeply concerned about their public image. And so you're not going to see any company saying, we don't care about climate change. We're going to just drill, baby, drill. Nobody says that. You're not going to see companies saying, yeah, we're back to discriminating now against disfavored minorities because Trump doesn't like us to have DEI. They're not going to say that. So they're wiping away some of the easy targets, some of the rhetorical commitments that you see in their annual reports or their websites. But I'd be really surprised if they change their actual practices because their employees insist on this, their consumers insist on this, their shareholders insist on it, and companies will be in big trouble if they backtrack on the actual policies rather than just the public rhetorical commitments.
Right. Now, one of the underlying assumptions that the business and human rights movement and the community has made is that companies want the rule of law and a level playing field. Can you think of examples where companies have played a very constructive role in defending rights? I mean, I've seen the amicus brief that were filed over Equal Marriage Act in America as one example of that kind. But can you point out? Because these are the kind of things that might inspire CEOs that there is still a lot that they can do.
Well, I mean, Salil, this may surprise you, but I don't impose a duty on corporate CEOs to say the right things. I'm aware that a lot of their lobbying with governments is just about tax breaks or corporate benefits of one sort or another. And if a company leader wants to lobby for better rights, by all means. But the duty that I impose much more absolutely on corporate leaders is to avoid complicity in human rights violations. That's the bottom line. That's not something where you can equivocate. And so to speak publicly, to lobby for pro-rights positions, great. But the absolute duty is to avoid complicity. And what that means is, first of all, in your own workplace, make sure you're not discriminating, make sure that you allow trade unions, make sure that you're not using forced or child labor, pretty straightforward things. But that's almost the easy part. The hard part, which is just as important, is to ensure that your supply chain is not infected by these abuses. And that's where corporate leaders are equivocating because they may look one step down in the supply chain, but they don't want to look too hard. They don't want to look too far down. And I think that in many ways, today's battle is about, what kind of responsibilities do corporations have for their supply chains? And it's a work in progress. We saw recently the European Union adopted standards, but they exempted many quite large, but not the largest corporations. They kind of minimized the duty to look down the chain of command, the supply chain. So I think we're moving in the right direction, but we're not where we should be. Now, one interesting thing, you say, when do corporations push for the right thing? Going back to when we started looking at this, back then, there was almost reflexive corporate hostility to the idea of government regulation. And so for the government to come in and say, you must have these kind of labor rights practices, their instinctive thing was to say, we don't want that. And one interesting development over, I would say, the last decade is that the bigger companies recognized that they needed to respect human rights, at least at a certain level, or they would face all the negative consequences that I just outlined. But their no-name competitor, the more obscure competitor, who didn't really have any reputation to lose because nobody knew who they were, they would not have to make some of the initial investments in respect for human rights that a bigger company would have to make. Now, I personally think that those kind of investments pay off over time because you get a more productive workforce, a more committed workforce. You avoid the potential disaster of being seen as complicit in human rights violations. So those investments pay off. But at the beginning, they can be a governing corporate cost. And the bigger companies we're seeing, we're making these investments, but our no-name competitors are not. And therefore, they're undercutting us in price. And so there was an interesting dynamic that emerged from that, which is that some of the bigger corporations suddenly said, well, maybe regulation isn't so bad in this area, because regulation would be a way of forcing our no-name competitors to live by the same standards that we, a bigger company, because of our public reputation, must abide by. And that's been an interesting evolution in recent years.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that, in a way, it ties into, and it's a neat segue to the next point I wanted to raise, that both Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Global Witness too, to some extent, have believed in the power of change through advocacy, through campaigning, which includes naming and shaming, and sometimes, even becoming friends of the court through amicus briefs and helping with investigations and increasingly sophisticated investigations. Both Amnesty and Human Rights Watch have done very good work in using technology, for example, to go after the refugees in the way. And I think there was a great report about what was happening in Saudi Arabia with the refugees at one point, I think last year or the year before, that Human Rights Watch did. Amnesty
they were being shot. The refugees
they were
coming
being
in.
shot, absolutely. I've seen the film, and I was at the Human Rights Watch dinner last year or the year before, where we were shown that film. So that I remember. And at Amnesty also, they've done some very good work in terms of, how technology has silenced certain voices, and women, particularly women and human rights defenders, and how they have been stalked and doxxed and so on. And yet, we don't have meaningful remedies. And of course, the culprit is the empty chair, being the government not having the prosecutorial will. So do human rights organizations need to rethink how to make corporate power more accountable?
Well, I think, first of all, as I indicated, Salil, and as I described really at great length in my book, the shaming works, and particularly with companies.
Yeah.
So I don't want to pretend that that's insignificant. It's very powerful. Second, we do need laws that are enforced. We need regulations. And, to give an example of a partially successful campaign, a big priority for Human Rights Watch, for myself, has been China's treatment of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. And at first, the Chinese government was detaining 1 million Uyghurs out of a population of about 11 million to basically force them to abandon their religion, their culture, their language. It was a clear crime against humanity. Some called it genocide because of the radical drop of birth rates. And this was one of the world's worst situations. As China was facing so much intense pressure, they began taking some people out of detention and putting them into forced labor. And so today, while detention continues as a big problem, forced labor in Xinjiang is a huge problem. And it infects some big industries. About 20% of the world's cotton is produced in Xinjiang. A huge percentage of the polysilicon that goes into solar panels is produced in Xinjiang. And so in the United States, we successfully got a law, not just a regulation, but an act of Congress. Ironically, our lead ally in the Senate was Marco Rubio, then a senator from Florida, now Trump's Secretary of State. But we pushed through something known as the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act. And what made this so powerful is that it presumptively barred any import to the United States, a huge market, unless you could prove that it was not the product of forced labor, which nobody could prove because Chinese supply chains are notoriously opaque. And so it basically bars anything from Xinjiang.
And also they made it very hard for investigations to take place because audit companies could not have access to those places. So companies could not satisfactorily tell the market that we are getting clean polysilicon, for example.
Precisely, which is why the only answer is just don't take anything from Xinjiang. So that was a success in the United States. But I want to contrast that with Europe. Because the European Union, of course, they say we're against forced labor. And they say we'll block anything that, comes into the European Union that is the product of forced labor. But you say, well, what about this good that just arrived from Xinjiang? Or I'm sorry, we don't have any information on that, so we're going to let it in. So they flip the presumption. They sort of assume that ignorance is a defense. When in this situation where the Chinese government is preventing any investigation, as you note, Salil, ignorance is not a defense. Ignorance should be a presumption of wrongdoing.
Yes.
And so the European Union pretends to have a policy against forced labor, but because they have not enacted a presumption against imports from Xinjiang comparable to the United States, it's a fake policy. And so this is an area where we've made progress in one big market, but there's a lot more to do in another big market.
Now, I want to talk about the global architecture because business and human rights is one component of the overall human rights architecture. Now, whether we look at UN Security Council and its composition, or the way the World Bank and IMF are created, the way countries get elected to the Human Rights Council, there are huge problems. I mean, we want to preserve the international architecture because of the kind of assaults we are seeing from the current US administration. But what we have is not entirely defensible. So how do we break that logjam? I mean, how do we do it so that we don't throw the baby with the bathwater, basically?
Well, no, I mean, that's obviously a big topic. The UN Security Council these days is utterly stymied by the veto, with the US, Russia, and China using the veto to protect their allies. And so many of the worst situations, whether it's Gaza or Ukraine or Myanmar, are largely untouchable by the UN Security Council because one of those three permanent members is blocking action. Now, the UN Human Rights Council is different. There's no veto there. And its sting is really felt. When it investigates, reports on, and condemns the government hates that. And, to give you one example, after the prior High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, issued a very strong report on China's persecution of the Uyghurs and said it was a possible crime against humanity, we then tried to put her report on the agenda of the UN Human Rights Council. We ended up losing by 2 votes. But the Chinese government was so worried about this that Xi Jinping himself was calling heads of state, urging them to vote with China. And you don't get the president of China doing that unless China cares desperately. Another example I describe in the book how we successfully got the UN Human Rights Council to create essentially a commission of inquiry about the Saudi-led coalition's bombing of Yemeni civilians. And that lasted for 4 years. It did very good work. When the Saudis finally succeeded in lifting it, civilian casualties in Yemen from the Saudi bombing immediately doubled. So it showed the Human Rights Council was making a big difference in terms of saving lives. And that remained the case until there's a ceasefire and that aerial conflict largely ended. So the council does a lot of good work, but you properly note, Salil, that there is a membership problem.
Yes.
And there are various highly repressive governments that are sitting on the council. And it's worth asking, why is that? Now, the Human Rights Council substituted and replaced what used to be known as the Human Rights Commission. And the old commission was filled with abusive governments because governments would flock there to try to undermine its work. And so what Kofi Annan introduced was the idea of competitive elections to the Human Rights Council. And you would have to compete, and there'd be a vote by the UN General Assembly. And we used these competitive elections for the first number of years. Every year, Human Rights Watch and our allies would target the most inappropriate candidate. And every year we would win. They would either withdraw voluntarily or they would lose in the election. And that's the way it was supposed to work. What has now happened is that the regional groups in the UN that propose candidates have begun to game the system. They've begun to only propose the same number of candidates as there are openings, essentially depriving the General Assembly of a choice. Now, this doesn't always happen. So, for example, the Asia-Pacific region recently has been putting forward one extra candidate. And that's how we've actually defeated Saudi Arabia twice. We almost defeated China. If there had been one more candidate, we probably would have defeated China. So that shows the importance of a competitive election. But the Western group, for example, only puts forward the same number of candidates as openings, a so-called closed slate, an uncompetitive slate. So the General Assembly doesn't have a choice. And of course, that makes the Western group having no credibility to urge other regions to put forward competitive slates too. Africa notoriously puts forward uncompetitive slates. So this is the primary reason why highly inappropriate governments sometimes still get to the Human Rights Council. But I don't want to paint too negative a picture, because we routinely get big things done at the Human Rights Council despite its imperfect membership. And the Council has acted in very important ways in not only the countries I've mentioned, but in Ukraine, Russia, Syria, Gaza, Israel-Palestine overall, Sudan, Myanmar. I mean, I could go on in many, many situations. And so I still think the Human Rights Council is the most important multilateral forum for human rights, but it could be better if we had or if there's like better adherence to the principles behind the idea of competitive elections for membership.
Thank you. And my final question is actually, I'm not wedded to 3 or 5 as a number, but what are the few things that you think you would tell people who are advocating for human rights, both inside and outside businesses, so that they feel inspired to carry on their work?
Well, that's a very good question. And let me make 2 points here. I mean, first, as we know, companies are very sensitive to their human rights image. So I would urge consumers to ask questions. So when you walk into a store and you want to buy a cotton shirt or a cotton blouse or whatever, ask the store, can you assure me that this was not made by forced labor in Xinjiang? And if they can't assure you, don't buy it. And then post the answer on social media. Boy, will you change things quickly when you start doing that. Yeah,
I mean, we have great example of conflict diamonds. And
Exactly.
I was involved in the campaign many, many years ago. Yeah.
No, precisely. So in other words, it takes consumers asking the difficult questions for companies suddenly to pay attention. Ask the question, but then post it on social media. That is a critical combination. And it's a simple truth. Is the company being responsible or not? There's nothing like that kind of publicity that will change company policy and in turn put pressure on China to stop using Uyghur forced labor. So that's one. The other thing is that the entire process of shaming, whether it's governments or companies, does depend on the public having a strong sense of right and wrong. And, as we know in today's world, people are most influenced by their family members, by their friends, by their work acquaintances, rather than distant pundits or institutions. And so what you personally say, and I mean this for every listener here, what you say around the dinner table, around the coffee machine at work, on social media, is influential. It's influential with the people who know you. And so I really urge people to discuss social issues, to post about it on social media. And what you're doing there, it seem silly, you may be saying, who am I? But you're important for the people who know you. And that reinforces and indeed strengthens the public sense of right and wrong, which is the foundation required to hold governments or corporations accountable.
Thank you, Ken, for the book, for leading a major human rights organization through the thick and thin and a very, very tough time. You stepped aside from it now, but we know that you'll continue to champion these issues for a long, long time. So thanks a lot. And thank you once again for the time.
Thanks so much, Salil, for having me.
Thanks to Ken Roth and my colleagues at the Tripathi for that enlightening discussion. And thank you for listening to this episode of Voices, which is brought to you from the Institute for Human Rights and Business. Until next time, be sure to share and follow this podcast, that way you will never miss an episode. And if you would like to find out more about the work that we do at IHRB, then head to ihrb.org.